Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the remainder of the Heart Notes. The last time we left off, we were talking a little bit about electrocardiogram and some of the key components of an electrocardiogram. In our next upcoming lab, we will have a virtual electrocardiogram laboratory activity, kind of the same way we did our virtual blood typing activity. So we'll have one of those. We talked a lot about the conducting system of the heart as far as the pacemaker or the SA node. And then we also talked about the AV bundle branches and exactly how that signal would be propagated. So just as a recap, we'll kind of look back at some of these additional slides that we saw for the conducting system, looking at the SA node and the fact that the heart has what we call pre-potential and it exhibits automaticity, which means it beats on its own. We also talked about that AV node being right between the atria and the ventricles and how that signal then branches down into the bundle branches and then finally to the Purkinje fibers. So what we're going to do today is we're going to finish up the discussion of this conducting system and then move on to the contractile components. So actually, we finished with all the conducting systems, so I apologize. We will be working on the contractile components. So the contractile cells, remember there are two groups of cells that are responsible for propagating the signal of the heartbeat through the heart. We have the conducting cells, which will conduct the electrical activity from the brain starting at the SA node, and then we have the contractile cells. The contractile cells are those cells which you're very familiar with. We looked at them under a microscope in AMP1. Those are the ones that are responsible for, as their name suggests, the contraction of the heart muscles. So once those Purkinje fibers, those conducting cells, distribute that stimulus, they're going to coordinate the contractile cells, which make up a good chunk of the heart muscle. When we think of cardiac muscle and cardiac cells, we're talking about contractile cells. It makes up most of that, and it's going to give us that beat of the heart, or the actual contraction of the heart. As we saw in lab, the left side of your heart is going to be more muscular than the right side. And as you all were able to so eloquently tell me, that the left side of the heart has to pump to the aorta, which is going to pump blood throughout the body and through the systemic circuit. Whereas the right side only needs to go to the lungs and the pulmonary circuit, so it doesn't need to be as muscular. So if we looked at the resting potential of the heart, if we look at a ventricular contractile cell and measure that with electrodes, the resting potential is about -90 millivolts. What you'll recognize is that millivoltage is a lot lower than what we saw for the resting voltage of normal cells. Usually the resting potential of the membrane for a cell was -70 millivolts in the nervous system as well as in the muscular system. Of an atrial cell, it's slightly higher, higher than ventricular cells' resting potential, but it's still a little bit lower than the resting potential of a normal cell. In just a few seconds, we're going to see exactly why that is. Keep in mind that we don't want the heart to ever experience tetanus, incomplete or complete tetany, and we don't want it to exhibit wave summation, where it could get to the point where there isn't an actual chance for the ventricles or the atria to relax. If the atria don't get a chance to completely relax or repolarize, then you won't have an efficient movement of the blood. So calcium ions play a major role in all of this. So just to recap, we talked about calcium ions in the blood chapter and how they have a major role in making sure that factor 10 is activated. These calcium ions in the cardiac contractions, they're responsible for elongating the absolute refractory period. The absolute refractory period, if you'll remember from your muscle notes, is that period of time when no matter how big the stimulus is, you will not be able to get a contraction. That's actually really good for us as the heart, because as I said before, it is the one muscle in your body that once it starts to operate at about, I believe it's 5 weeks of gestation, once that heart starts to pump and operate, it never stops. That muscle never relaxes until the day that you take your last breath. So we don't want it to ever exhibit tetany. So we wanted to have a longer absolute refractory period. In much the same way, we saw that the pre-potential, or the resting potential, is much lower for both atrial contractile cells as well as ventricular contractile cells, because we want it to take a little bit longer time to reach threshold, if you will, so that we have an ability to completely relax. And what helps that is calcium. So calcium has a positive charge to it. So because we have this positively charged entity floating around, we're able to stay at an action potential, remember that was about plus 30, for a little bit longer time before that calcium is reabsorbed by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So here we have a beautiful graph that's illustrating the fact that the heart has a longer absolute refractory period. So we have this depolarization here where sodium ions enter, and as a result of those sodium ions entering, we go from a negative number to a positive number. So we have this depolarization, which could also be characterized as a contraction, and then we have this plateau phase. At our plateau phase, we don't just peak and then immediately come back down as we would for a skeletal muscle contraction or as we would for any other synaptic transmission. Now we have calcium that's going to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or that calcium that's released is going to be a more abundant amount of calcium that's there, and then very slowly will those calcium channels start to close. As a result, we have an absolute refractory period that lasts about 200 milliseconds, which in the grand scheme of things is quite a long time, considering that we've seen the absolute refractory period lasts for as short as 5 or 10 milliseconds. So the fact that it goes up to 200 milliseconds gives us a very long absolute refractory period. So at this point here, we go into our repolarization where sodium ion channels are going to close much the exact same way as we've learned before in AMP1, and then those potassium ion channels are going to open up, and as a result, they're going to lose all of that potassium. And then we get back down to our resting potential. So I'm going to let you all take a moment to compare these graphs, where this is a graph for a skeletal muscle contraction, both looking at the millivoltage of it, the time for the absolute refractory, which is highlighted in blue on each of these graphs, the relative refractory, which remember in relative refractory, you can get another contraction, but it's relative to the size of the stimulus that comes in. And then we're also looking at the amount of tension that is built for skeletal muscle. And then at the bottom graph, we're looking at a cardiac muscle twitch, and we're also looking at the tension that's required to build. So I wanted you to take just a few moments to study some of those differences. And as you can see, much shorter absolute refractory period as opposed to the much longer absolute refractory period for cardiac muscle cells, and that's completely because of the role of calcium. So very important to understand and to remember for your upcoming exam. So now that we have an understanding of how a cardiac muscle twitch is conducted, we understand that it has a much longer absolute refractory period. We understand that the resting potential of both atrial and ventricular cells is slightly lower than that what we'd find for normal skeletal muscle cells or even a normal resting potential of any other cell. Now we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is the contraction and the relaxation of any specific chamber of the heart. So we have two phases of that. There's a contraction phase, which we're going to call systole. So keep in mind that we've talked about depolarization, meaning contraction, and now we've got to have a new term, systole, which also means contraction. And then the resting phase of that, or relaxation or repolarization, we call diastole, or diastole. The blood pressure in any chamber is going to always rise during systole. And remember, systole means what? Is that contraction or relaxation? That's contraction. I think your book has a really interesting way of trying to remember it. When you are under diastolic, in the diastolic phase of the cardiac cycle, di meaning two, you put your 2 feet up and rest. So I thought that was an interesting mnemonic device to help you all remember which one is the contraction and which one is the relaxation. So in any chamber, the pressure of the blood that's being exerted on the walls of that chamber is going to increase during the contraction. Let's stop and think about that for a second. That makes sense. So if we're in the atria, that AV valve, bicuspid valve on the right or the left, and the tricuspid valve On the right, they're going to be closed. When the atria contract, there's less surface area or room for the blood to swish around, if you will. So as a result, the pressure in that chamber is going to be heightened because the blood's being squeezed at this point and those valves have yet to open. During diastole, or relaxation, that pressure is going to fall. That makes sense. Once again, we're not squeezing the walls in on the blood that's in there. We're allowing it to relax. Blood, and this is a very important thing to remember because we're going to talk about it again when we get into the cardiovascular chapter, blood is always going to flow from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So blood goes from areas of high pressure to low pressure. This will be controlled by the timing of the contractions, and this is also controlled by the direction of one-way valves. Those atrioventricular valves between the atria and the ventricles, and the semilunar valves between the ventricles and either the aorta for the aortic semilunar valve or the pulmonary trunk from the pulmonary semilunar valve. So let's talk about the atria and the atrial systole. So atrial systole, or atrial contraction, is going to eject blood into the ventricles. So at the end of this process of contraction, the culminating event that we want to take place is that we want a majority of the blood, because there will be some that's going to be left over, and we'll talk about that in just a few slides. We want the majority of that blood to go down into the ventricles. So at the end of atrial systole, the ventricles are going to contain the maximum amount of blood. At this point, I'm going to star this because it's important. At this point, at the end of atrial systole, we call this end diastolic volume. Now, end diastolic volume is going to be a measurement of the blood that's contained in the ventricles after the atria have contracted. In ventricular systole, the ventricles contract. They're going to build up pressure. As a result of that buildup of pressure, the atrioventricular valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves, are going to close. They close as a result of that isovolumeric contraction because of the ventricles contracting. We don't want the blood to run back up to the atria. We want the blood to go in one direction, from the atria down to the ventricles and out through the pulmonary or out through the aorta. Ventricular ejection is where the pressure in the ventricles that's been exceeded from those contractile cells is going to exceed the pressure of the atria and of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and as a result, it will open those semilunar valves. And as a result of that pressure is going to close the AV valves, the atrioventricular valve, bicuspid, tricuspid valve, or mitral valve, tricuspid valve, and it's going to open the semilunar valve. The amount of blood that is ejected from those ventricles we call the stroke volume. So far we've had two terms that I've highlighted in these past 2 pages that I've starred because I think they're very important. End diastolic volume is the amount the ventricles contain the maximum amount of blood there in the end diastolic volume, and then we have stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that's ejected from the ventricles. When the ventricular pressure falls, the ventricles contain the end systolic volume. Not every single thing in the ventricles is going to get pumped out. They're not going to get pumped out clean. And that's for a couple of reasons they don't get pumped out clean. There's just going to be a small amount, a fraction of that left. So the ventricles contain the end systolic volume of about 40% of the end diastolic volume. Remember, the end diastolic volume was the amount of blood at the beginning, and the end systolic volume is the amount of blood that's left over after the stroke volume, when there's a certain amount of blood that's been ejected out. So the end systolic volume is the amount of blood that gets left over in the ventricles at the end of a ventricular contraction or ventricular systole. In ventricular diastole, the ventricular pressure is higher than the atrial pressure. As a result, at this point here, all the heart valves are closed. when the atrial pressure is higher than the ventricular pressure, when those atria are contracting, the AV valves will open, and as a result of those opening of the AV valves, the atria will passively fill, and then you'll have the ventricles passively fill as well, where there isn't actually a pumping action that's happening, so that's why we consider it a passive filling of these atria and these ventricles. One of the other reasons why we're going to have just a small, tiny fraction of blood that's left over in the ventricles after the stroke volume, which we call our end-systolic volume. So when we try to listen to those heart sounds, when we're listening for those heart sounds, we're actually listening to key events that are happening in the cardiac cycle. When you hear that first lub of the lub-dub, 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 what's happening there, and this kind of graph is showing you that you have your left ventricle or left atria, and you have your left ventricle are noted by the ventricle is the red line and the atria is the blue line. At that first lub-dub here, notice that we have our AV valves are closed, but the semilunar valves are open. And if we were to measure the pressure in the aorta, we see where that pressure in the aorta is. And remember, blood likes to go from a area of high pressure to low pressure. So this is a much lower area of pressure at this point, and will cause that pressure to be higher. When we have that dub sound, that is an indication that the semilunar valves are closed, and when the semilunar valves are closed, the AV valves are open. A heart murmur is kind of a slishing you hear between the lub-dub. It's kind of lub-sh-dub, lub-sh-dub. A lot of times people will grow out of a heart murmur. That just means that the valves aren't closing completely. It could be the sound of a heart murmur could be indicative of faulty valves or valves not fully closing, or a prolapsed valve, or a valve instead of moving down into the ventricles, the AV valve or a mitral valve or a tricuspid valve will move up into the atria, and that's not going to allow for good performance of the heart. So it's poor performance of the heart, so it may need to be repaired. So more on cardiodynamics, now that we understand the contraction and the relaxation or systole and the diastole cycle on here. The movement of force generated by the cardiac contractions we've talked about for the end diastolic volume as well as the end systolic volume. Remember, the end diastolic volume is the maximum blood that's in the ventricles. The end systolic volume is the blood that's left over in the ventricles after they have contracted. And then you have your stroke volume. Your stroke volume is the amount of blood that's been ejected from the ventricles. The ejection fraction is a percentage of the amount of blood, the maximum, that is represented by the stroke volume. So how much was there to begin with that got shot out? We can call that the ejection fraction, but we've just been calling it the stroke volume. So for cardiac output, to measure cardiac output, we typically only look at the left ventricle. And the reason we look at the left ventricle is because it's going to be the one responsible for shooting blood and distributing blood all throughout the body. So to measure cardiac output, we take the heart rate and multiply it by the stroke volume. So the cardiac output is going to be measured in milliliters per minute. The heart rate is going to be measured in beats per minute, and stroke volume is going to be measured in mils per minute. Keep in mind to look at these units. Mils per minute, beats per minute, minute, and mils per minute. So if I were to give you a stroke volume, and this is a question I always ask every year as a short answer question option on this very first exam, if I give you a stroke volume that's in liters and a cardiac output that's in milliliters, then you're going to have to do some converting. And it's real easy to convert from mil to liters or liters to milliliters. There are 1,000 milliliters in 1 liter. So some factors that can affect your cardiac output, we already understand, so let's just look at this formula again. Cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So obviously, things that are going to affect cardiac output are going to be heart rate and stroke volume. What kinds of things can affect your heart rate? Well, the types of hormones that you have circulating, adrenaline, noradrenaline, serotonin, those sorts of things can either alleviate or depress your heart rate. Acetylcholine is a hormone that actually acts as an inhibitor for the cardiac muscle cells, so that can affect your heart rate. Autonomic innervation the nerves that are sending the impulse to the conducting cells, which in turn send that information to the contractile cells, can affect your heart rate. Things that affect your stroke volume: how much blood did we start off with in the ventricles? How much blood do we have left over? If we have more blood left over than that was left out, then our stroke volume is going to be very low. So those are all things that can affect your cardiac output. So this you're probably very familiar with when we talk about autonomic innervation. We understand that your medulla oblongata, the most prehistoric portion of your brain, is responsible for a lot of your autonomic conditions, including breathing as well as heart rate. In your medulla oblongata, you have what we call cardioacceleratory centers as well as cardioinhibitory centers. Cardioacceleratory centers are going to stimulate your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight nervous system, and they have a tendency to increase your heart rate. Cardioinhibitory centers, on the other hand, are going to control the parasympathetic division of this process, and this is going to in turn slow your heart rate. When we look at cardiac reflexes, we have cardiac centers that measure blood pressure, which are your baroreceptors, and you have chemoreceptors that can also measure your oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. If either of those are high or low or not quite where they'll be, that can send a message back to your medulla oblongata to send more frequent stimuli, or it will strike the cardioacceleratory centers to send more frequent stimuli to the SA node to quicken the heart rate. What we call your autonomic tone is kind of the dual innervation between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, and it gives you kind of this resting tone, if you will. And how that dual innervation is maintained is through the release of acetylcholine, which is inhibitory, and norepinephrine, which is excitatory. So at any point in time, these hormones are going to be affecting, or neurotransmitters are going to be affecting the cardiac muscle cells to make sure that it has a nice resting heart rate. And what your resting heart rate has a lot to do with your genetics, with your diet, and even your fitness level. People that are extremely fit, you have athletes, runners, wrestlers, even if you have a really good workout plan, they have a lower resting heart rate than those that aren't as athletic or aren't as physically fit. The reason being is that their heart is able to pump blood more efficiently and therefore doesn't have to work as hard. So as we've already talked about with the contractile cells, that the SA node is your pacemaker. So the effects of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic stimulation are going to give you the greatest effect at the SA node because they are it is the heart's pacemaker. It sets the pace for the contraction of the heart itself. Acetylcholine, which in the muscle chapter, we saw it as an excitatory neurotransmitter. We talked about it a lot last semester in A&P1, but in the heart, it actually has more of a parasympathetic stimulation. It's going to help slow the heart rate. Now, when I say slow the heart rate, keep in mind that this is all relatively speaking. This is if you just think you saw a bear run in the room and you had norepinephrine speed up the heart rate and you realize, oh, that's just my cousin David in a bear costume. So it's going to have more acetylcholine. That's going to trigger the release of more acetylcholine into your bloodstream so that it will slow the heart rate down. Norepinephrine's job is the absolute opposite. And remember that autonomic tone is established because there are always going to be at any point in time various amounts or degrees or concentrations of acetylcholine and norepinephrine where we can maintain this fine balance. It's kind of like fine-tuning your bath water, that if you have too much hot water on, you're going to scald yourself. Too much cold water on, you're not going to be able to be warm enough. So you're kind of always tweaking that balance with your bath water until it's just the right temperature. It's another way to think of autonomic tone in cardiodynamics. The atrial reflex, also known as the Bainbridge reflex, is going to adjust the heart rate into the amount of blood that's returning into the atria. The more blood you have turning into the atria, the more those stretch receptors are going to be felt. And as a result of those stretch receptors being triggered, it's going to trigger the atria to increase the contractions and increase the heart rate. This is through increased sympathetic activity where we have this atrial reflex happening. So large volume of blood comes back. That's going to trigger the heart to, or the atria at least, to pump more forcefully, which is going to push more blood down into the ventricles. And the ventricles are also in turn going to have their stretch receptors are going to be triggered, and it'll contract more forcefully. And what we have overall is a faster heart rate, or an increased heart rate. In diastolic and stroke volume, when you're at rest, the end-diastolic volume is low and the stroke volume is low. So the amount of blood that's ejected out, the amount of blood that you start with is low. Myocardium is not really going to stretch that much. So those ventricles of atria really aren't stretching that much. When you exercise, on the other hand, you have more venous return. So that vein bridge reflex is going to be triggered. As a result, that end-diastolic volume, or the volume of blood in the ventricles, is going to increase. That's going to cause the ventricles to stretch more because the atria stretch more, so they're going to contract more forcefully, and it's going to increase the amount of blood that leaves the heart, which is absolutely essential when you're exercising, because you need to get the maximum amount of blood you can to your lungs, as well as to the other areas of your body that you're using during your exercising event. So the Frank-Starling principle is basically what we just said. As your end-diastolic volume increases, your stroke volume increases. So this principle is really pretty intuitive. Now, there are some physical limits in the increase of your stroke volume because your end-diastolic volume increased. One of those is that your ventricular expansion is going to be limited by the connective tissue that's surrounding your heart. So you don't have just an infinite expansion of your ventricles because there's connective tissue. You have the pericardium that's going to prevent the heart from just infinitely expanding outwards. You also have the fibrous skeleton of the heart itself. It's not a real skeleton, but just the framework of the ventricles and the atria and those muscles. It can only stretch so much. So the physical limitations are basically saying that the ventricles can only stretch so much, so there's only going to be so much of an increase we can get with the stroke volume as it relates to end-diastolic volume. Hormones that affect the heart rate, we've talked about two of those already. We've talked about acetylcholines, and neurotransmitter, could also act as a heart hormone. These hormones here increase the heart rate by sympathetic stimulation of the SA node, tell it to either quicken up here. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, as well as thyroid hormone. Those are all hormones that will affect the heart rate by increasing it. For the sympathetic division, norepinephrine is released by postganglionic fibers of your cardiac nerves, those nerves that come into your heart, and most of which are going to land at the SA node. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, as we learned last semester in AMP1, are released from your adrenal medulla, or the middle part of the adrenal, not the outside of the cortex. As a result, it causes the SA node to send a stronger signal to the AV bundle and the Purkinje fibers, which will cause the ventricles to contract with more force, which is going to increase the stroke volume and decreases the amount of blood that's left over after the contraction, or the end systolic volume. For parasympathetic activity, those hormones, we have acetylcholine that's released by your vagus nerve, and it's going to reduce the force of those cardiac contractions. So it's basically acting in the opposite way that we saw for norepinephrine, thyroid hormones, and epinephrine. So there are not just acetylcholine, norepinephrine, or epinephrine are the only hormones that will affect cardiodynamics. They're just the most important ones, the ones that we're going to talk about. There are many different hormones that can affect a heart contraction, and there are different kinds of pharmaceutical drugs that will actually mimic some of these hormones, whether they be sympathetic or parasympathetic, fight or flight, or rest and repose. We have beta blockers. We can stimulate or beta block receptors, so we can stimulate receptors to tell them to beat more quickly, or we can block them. Beta blockers interfere with the ability of epinephrine to bind, so even though your body may have been releasing lots of epinephrine, if you're having an issue where the ventricles aren't pumping effectively, they're just quivering, and what that quivering we call it is fibrillation, or the atria are fibrilling, we can administer what we call beta blockers. And what those beta blockers will do is they will affect those beta channels that epinephrine needs to bind to affect that SA node and to affect those cells. We also have pharmaceutical drugs that can affect calcium ion channels, what we call calcium channel blockers, which act in the same way, is that they won't allow calcium to have that longer absolute refractory period, or as much calcium have that longer absolute refractory period, so that we can get a stimulation to happen a little bit more quickly. And so here we have factors that are affect stroke volume, venous return, filling time, increased sympathetic division, decreasing sympathetic division, different types of hormones that can affect either your end-diastolic or your end-systolic volume, which is going to always affect your stroke volume. So cardiac reserve is the difference between your resting cardiac output and your maximal cardiac output. So if you can calculate your resting cardiac output and your maximal cardiac output, if you subtract the two, you're left with what we call your cardiac reserve. So this is kind of the same graph we saw earlier with a little bit more detail, where we looked at the heart rate and things that could affect the heart rate, autonomic innervation and innervation in hormones, and things that could affect stroke volume. Anything that affects the end-diastolic or the end-systolic volume will affect stroke volume. So I'm not going to really do a whole lot of discussion here. I'm just going to let you look at this graph and kind of let it all soak in, because all of these things we've already talked about. I just want you to see how we're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. So the last few slides we have here are just the learning objectives for you, which should probably be at the beginning of your notes. I do have two videos that I would like for you to watch, a video over the anatomy of the heart as well as one over the blood flow. These are embedded into your own slides, the slides that you can pick off the blackboard. I won't be taking the time to show them here on Collaborate because they never show properly. I have to try to fix that that little quirk out sometime during this semester. All right. Well, I hope you all have a great morning, noon, or night whenever you're viewing this video, and I will see you all in lab.